So in many ways, I think crypto has been sort of the first killer app on blockchain. What's your sort of perspective on crypto these days and also looking forward?
So when I did one of my first talks, and it was like 4 or 5 years ago, the cost of participating on an exchange and converting and wasn't quite as complicated, and the cost has actually gotten almost as high as using traditional fiat money converters. But in the early days, there was a statistics from the Gates Foundation that talked about how many migrant workers were sending money back to developing countries. I don't know if it was like 3 or 4 times what world aid sends to these developing countries, and it has a huge effect on the education and healthcare of these the individuals in these countries, right? And so the idea was that if you could facilitate and drop that cost, it would contribute billions to that, right? And so the Gates Foundation published some numbers around billions of dollars that would be saved if you could decrease that spread that those particular people specifically were paying. But I think what's happened is that it's put a lot of pressure on the traditional exchanges in order to decrease that cost, because all of a sudden people are like, whoa, look at these numbers. This is absurd, right? But I think that what's interesting about crypto is that it was the lubricant that helped all this hyper innovation take place. And what's interesting is that all this cross-pollination and people would have one successful project and then invest in another project and start another project. And so it's really enabled this hyper innovation to take place and the sharing of ideas around the world. And if you look back at the early days of the internet, people always talk about pets.com and how Bezos was one of the biggest investors in that, and so how some of this roadkill actually ended up being great fertilizer and educational aids to the later models that evolved. And I think that what's happened over the course of the last 2 years has been huge. It's really facilitated a lot of sharing and learning. And I mean, in those days you didn't have GitHub, but now people are sharing all kinds of information. They're on Telegram. And so outside of all the regulatory concerns about it, I think that the amount of innovation and excitement about technologies and data and visibility and transactions has been huge. And I think that there are a lot of new business models that will be facilitated as a result of all this hyper innovation that's taken place. So